in the lunch bags. No problem.
No, but she missed secretary. I think she has a clinic thingy.
Better then, right? You didn't break any bones.
Yeah, no, it was Saturday.
What did you get, turkey and cheese? Hey, looking good, dude. Thanks. How are you?
Doing well.
Okay, very cool. Well, I have Siegel for con law. Talks about
Oh, we talked about it.
Yep.
Group, and I think it was posted there.
Not possible.
Kind of figured it out. It's nationwide.
Yeah.
And it's been,
I don't need it.
faculty. It's like switch it up.
So the guy who's speaking is really old. The guy who's speaking? No, Leuchtenburg. He graduated from college the year my dad was born. No, I'm sorry. He received his PhD the year my dad was born. It's really old. He's been retired since 1992. And then he kept working for 10 more years. Yeah. This guy is really old. Well, how are you?
Wednesday.
Yeah, as compared to say Boston, but I totally agree. I feel like I have an entitlement, right? I have an entitlement to good weather. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, like.
For it.
I like the.
No, it's sitting here.
Stories in Boston.
You can sit as close as you like to, Rice. No,
Jumping out,
wouldn't be afraid.
Not
Not that close.
Created a rule that if you dig out a space, it's yours for at least 24 hours after. Yep. But no, this is the mayor's office issues this, sort of like like the force of law, right?
It's so far.
And so Bostonians being Bostonians, when people violate this rule, the sanctions are extreme.
Definitely had some.
Yes. So my favorite,
had some
the mail gun
finishing
was
the
this time sentence that was obvious. My favorite one is the person who painstakingly
That's the piece that I'm sorry. Because I mean,
on
they're
top
still
of the
fractured.
car.
I mean, there's still fractured portions
Ended
of
up being like 2 stories high, and it was, and as you know,
that I'm legitimately worried about.
because I was concerned they might do something from inside the car, like an inhaler.
Doesn't that look like a dude?
I know you're in the middle of something, but I saw that sign and I realized why you didn't sit here.
Thank you. Just thinking,
not
the dinner was so much fun.
Oh my gosh.
I had it too. Was I just like totally unaware of this?
I think you were a little stunned, but it was too much fun. Yeah, that was good. It was a great group. Yeah. And it's funny because I've never met John.
I mean, very,
And I've talked to him a bunch of times.
You're
So I didn't know who he was when he just walked in. Well, I was there first when he came in. Had no idea who he was. And just
All
a
in.
weird thing, like I've been talking to you for years.
About the
I just never looked him up to see his picture.
whole piece.
So it's
Should I talk to them?
Where we've been working on the superlative list. We already have several proposals.
Can one fit it?
no, absolutely.
Dinner at the end of the year. You may have to do multiple superlatives for some people, or a lot of.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens if there's more than one.
I don't know, but the comment is, I am writing an article. I assume this is going.
Not even like will be true. I mean, based on its that's happened multiple times.
And
Always right by the side. Or is it all right?
what I want to get out.
Yeah, no,
I don't have any reason to believe that the university didn't
Well, again, I sometimes like,
fully an investigation.
and then it hasn't just like
It's
the way
part
that
of the
it will stuff,
problem
it's just
with
hurriedly for an hour and then leave it. So I don't know.
Bill 9 responses that
Reasonable hours for this one.
will circulate through
yeah, we have
to suggest that there
most
wasn't
proposed was when she went with him with shovels to shovel out the driveway of the school, so that hopefully, hopefully the next day they might actually have to spend the afternoon on shoveling. Obviously, it's just hard to get
Yes, I've taken pretty good breaks my entire life.
How are you?
Yep. Same thing with the bar. Also,
Sartorially by Dean Charles. He looks very smooth.
the other statutes, you know, at least so far as I know, 6 there's no case.
Any insight?
The political take on the Netanyahu speech, however,
The bill itself takes some lives,
is this
I talked busy. Oh, you did? Okay. Hi, how are you? Judy Allen Dodson. Hi, nice
And
to
I'm
meet
Doc
you.
Brown. I'm with Centenary. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah.
And then I went to school Sandy was at my too when I was at Harvard, so we were all together. She and Juliette Mello, myself, and
He would have created an environment in which there was no desire to work with him beyond what you were. That
she's writing her column
was by your
and
own
looking for the next
constituents.
opportunity. Yeah, so, but yes, Sandy and I were together.
There was no.
I didn't know you were
I'm on a
yeah, so
but I
come
will
talk
talk
to
to
me.
you if I need to.
I'm gonna have some people over for dinner. Maybe you'll come.
Well, maybe you will invite me.
Yeah, because they wanted to meet a guy who
Oh, really?
Given the fact that the judge
The issue, I'm like, I guess I can chat now.
Made me more hostile to him, but I was already hostile to him. So maybe
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I heard it was great.
I don't even know why I didn't come to that one.
It's a program.
You were supposed to go meet they gave my ticket to
Who they get? You were sick. All right. Okay.
Did you have to get it? So give me your card. And we have to show it at my mom.
Yeah.
the number of those things sort of various ways.
Hi. How are you?
Realism.
I know. I love that. Thank you. I love that.
So welcome everybody to Duke Law School, to this John Hope Franklin Centenary event. This is the 100th anniversary of John Hope's birth, and we're so delighted to have his son, John Franklin, here, and his daughter-in-law, Karen Franklin. Welcome to Duke Law School. And it's great to welcome back these two very distinguished people that you see seated here in front of you. William Leuchtenburg is the William Rand Kenan Jr. Professor Emeritus of History at UNC Chapel Hill, and he is one of the great scholars of the New Deal and of Franklin Roosevelt. His book on Roosevelt won the Francis Parkman Award and the Bancroft Award. In the history world, it just doesn't get any better than that. That's like winning the Golden Globes and the Oscars and a lot of other things in between. He knew John Hope for a very long time. He marched with him in Montgomery, and it's just a pleasure to have you here today, Bill. And seated next to him is no stranger to the law school, Walter E. Dellinger III, and Walter is the Douglas Maggs Professor Emeritus of Law, and there's a nice connection between Walter's professorship and Bill Leuchtenburg, because I understand that Douglas Maggs was pretty sure that if FDR's court-packing plan had worked, that he was going to be one of the guys that got packed onto the court, at least so it was said. He was quite a handful, I gather, and so is Walter, it turns out. Anyway, Walter's done just about everything. He has just had the most incredible career in the law. He's been the Solicitor General of the United States. He's been the Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy. He's been a wonderful constitutional law scholar. He's a brilliant teacher. He's an amazing, I think, somewhat to my surprise, I must say, and Walter did appear before me when I was a district judge. He's a wonderful practitioner. I mean, he just can do it all. He developed an amazing appellate practice up in D.C., clerked for Hugo Black. He went to UNC and to Yale. And the third member of the panel, who isn't here, but why we are all here today, is John Hope Franklin. And probably many of the people in the room actually don't know so much about John Hope, but John Hope was a great historian of the of both centuries. He died in 2009, and he's much missed here at Duke. He grew up in Oklahoma. His father was a lawyer, and he had a very interesting, long-standing relationship with the law. For a long time, he thought he would become a lawyer, but he told me that he noticed that his father had a good deal of trouble making a living in the law, and so he thought history would be a better way to make a living. That will come as a shock to at least the historians in the room. He graduated from Fisk. He got his PhD in history from Harvard in 1941, and then, in that time, he was confined to the historically black schools, so he taught at Fisk and then at North Carolina Central and at Howard, and he was very productive and very happy at all of those institutions. And then in 1956, he went to chair the history department at Brooklyn College, which was a kind of a watershed event for him as people recognized what a powerful historian he was. Then in 1964, he joined the University of Chicago History Department, and he became chair of that department. And it was then, I just will say on a personal note, that I came to know John Hope and John because they moved to Chicago, and John Hope became a very, very close family friend and even named an orchid for my father, an orchid that he had on the day that he died. His book, From Slavery to Freedom, is a seminal work in history. He was a historian who was engaged in the world and in the world of law. So he was on the history team in Brown versus Board of Education. And then later, when he came here to Duke to teach, he taught with Bill Leuchtenburg and Walter Dellinger, from 1985 to 1992, for 7 years, a course that, if you talk to any of our graduates from that period, they will tell you it was just the most wonderful experience that they had. And John Hope used to say that his career as a historian would not have been complete had he not had those 7 years in the law school, because law and history have this intimate relationship. They're somewhat similar and they're somewhat different. But he was a historian who also made history, and that's his life itself is just so interesting. So we will reflect on John Hope, we will reflect on the course, and we're so lucky to have the two of you here with us here today. And I think, Professor Leuchtenburg, you're going to kick it off, and welcome. Thank you.
Neither Walter nor I have said a word yet, but you have already heard the most electrifying thing that you're likely to hear today, which is that historians make more money than lawyers. In the 30 years that I taught history at Columbia, beginning in 1952, I started each day with the expectation that the front page of the New York Times would orient me toward what was the most important event or events of that day. But one morning in 1956, I picked up the Times and found on the front page a headline about an appointment, the appointment of a chairman to the history department at Brooklyn College. And that was not the kind of story one expected to find on the front page. Indeed, it was not the kind of story one would usually find anywhere in the New York Times. But the Times thought it noteworthy because never before in the country's history had an African American been appointed to chair a history department in a predominantly white institution. This singular episode characterizes all of John Hope's life. He was always a pioneer, always a pathbreaker. Our relative proximity in New York, Brooklyn College, for those of you who are not familiar with New York, being just across the East River from Manhattan, began a friendship between us that lasted for more than half a century. In 1965, as the dean said, we marched together in Montgomery with Martin Luther King. We didn't know it at the time, incidentally, but a fellow marcher took a photograph of us. And when a few years ago, the photographer, the actor Dennis Hopper, published a 544-page collection of his work, that image of us marching in Alabama with fellow historians was highlighted on the cover. In 1987, under the leadership of Walter Dellinger, we testified together before the Senate Judiciary Committee against the nomination by President Reagan of Robert Bork to the United States Supreme Court. And most memorably, again in tandem with Walter, we taught a course here together at Duke Law School for 7 years. Most of all, I think, not of these many events that John Hope and I shared, but rather of the many lovely evenings at the Franklin home on Pineview Road in Durham, where he and Aurelia radiated such warmth that you felt it come out to meet you even before you crossed the threshold. And John Hope and Aurelia never failed to ask about my son Josh, before, during, and after the years that he was a student here at Duke. John Hope, who started teaching in 1936 at his alma mater, Fisk, went on to St. Augustine's in Raleigh, North Carolina College in Durham, and Howard, before being appointed to chair that history department at Brooklyn College. There at Brooklyn, he became a legendary teacher. Among his students, as undergraduates, were a future United States Senator, Barbara Boxer, and the historian Richard Polenberg, who, after getting his PhD with me at Columbia, went on to teach more students than anyone else in the history of Cornell University. 8 years after arriving at Brooklyn, John Hope was appointed chair of the history department at the University of Chicago, where he directed no fewer than 33 PhD dissertations, numbers of the students becoming outstanding scholars. John Hope was also visiting professor at numerous American universities, including Harvard, from which years earlier he received his PhD, and he held appointments abroad, including in Australia, as Fulbright Distinguished Professor and as Pitt Professor at Cambridge University. He wound up his history teaching career as James B. Duke Professor here at Duke. And his presence continues here in the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies. In the annals of the historical profession, John Hope Franklin is unique. In the entire period, stretching back into the 19th century, only one scholar has had the honor of having been elected president of the Southern Historical Association, president of the Organization of American Historians, president of the American Historical Association, and president of the American Studies Association. And that person was John Hope Franklin. He received a host of awards: the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor that can be bestowed on a civilian in this country, the Gold Medal of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and astonishingly, more than 100 honorary degrees. I looked it up this morning and found he fell only 9 degrees short of making it into the Book of Records, making it into Guinness. It was an awesome experience to walk into the basement of his home and see them hanging there on the walls. John Hope published 11 books, edited 8 more, and turned out over 100 scholarly essays. His book on Reconstruction did more than any other volume to correct the racist assumptions that unhappily once prevailed. And his classic, From Slavery to Freedom, which first appeared in 1947, sold more than 2 million copies and was translated into French, German, Portuguese, Chinese, and Japanese. While carrying on this impressive career in teaching and writing, he also made important contributions to the public realm. In particular, he played an instrumental role as advisor to Thurgood Marshall and the other NAACP attorneys preparing the brief in the landmark case of Brown v. Board, striking down Jim Crow in public schools. No fewer than 3 American presidents offered him ambassadorships, Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter. And some years ago, a presidential campaign tour through this state ran badly behind schedule because the Clintons and the Gores did not want to forego the opportunity to meet with John Hope. Subsequently, Bill Clinton appointed him to chair the President's Initiative on Race, an assignment he carried out with the vigor of a man generations younger. He accomplished all this despite having to cope with the outrageous indignities that have too often been the lot of Black Americans. At one point, as I recounted on another occasion, John Hope, on a train from Greensboro to Durham, had to stand all the way in a Jim Crow baggage car from where he could see whites comfortably seated in a passenger car sneering at him. They were Nazi prisoners of war. When, as a graduate student, he sought to pursue historical research at the archives in Raleigh, he was not permitted to sit with white researchers, but was shunted off to an isolated chamber. He was given keys to the archives only so that white clerks would not have to assist him by carrying boxes to him. The story has an ironical sequel. White researchers rebelled at this arrangement because they thought that John Hope, in having the keys, was being favored. And faced with this rebellion, the archivist threw up his hands and ended the Jim Crow arrangement in the reading room. The Washington, D.C. he encountered when he took up his position at Howard in 1947 was little better. A year earlier, I arrived there as the only white on the field staff of a civil rights lobby headed by a Philip Randolph. I was 23. I found that I could not eat with my colleagues at any downtown restaurant, not even at the greasiest People's Drugstore counter. Nor was there a downtown movie a Black citizen could go to, a downtown hotel at which, in the nation's capital, he or she could stay. That was John Hope's universe as he was launching his career. Yet despite all of the indignities to which he had been subjected, and alas, was to continue to be subjected to the end of his life, where a man of obvious dignity and distinction he found in Manhattan, he often could not get a cab to stop because he was Black. Despite this experience, John Hope was conspicuously a man of equipoise. Everyone who ever knew him marveled at him as a man who, knowing what he had to endure, could have such a sweetness of temperament. That alone would be remarkable. But still more remarkable is the fact that he was able to combine that equable composure with a courageous commitment to speak out against injustice. The action I remember most vividly came when Walter and John Hope and I were testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator Simpson of Wyoming sought to browbeat witnesses by saying that if we did not go along with the president's nominee to the Supreme Court, there would never again be any opportunity to speak, for never again would there be public hearings. We had completed our testimony and were not in a position to respond. But intrepidly, John Hope broke in and confronted our tormentor. "Senator Simpson, do you mean to tell me," John Hope began, in an electrifying exchange that was broadcast later that day by NPR over All Things Considered. When the senator was forced to back down and concede that, in fact, there would be hearings in the future, John Hope responded quietly, dismissively, "I'll be back." John Hope Franklin was a man for all seasons. He served on the boards of the Orchestral Association of Chicago, of the Chicago Public Library, of the Museum of Science and Industry. He was such an expert fly fisherman that in Montana streams, when the trout got word that once again John Hope had crossed the state border, they hid out under boulders. For some 40 years, he cultivated orchids, even in Chicago, where wintry blasts come off Lake Michigan. If you walked into his greenhouse, you found him nurturing hundreds of species from 6 continents. He carried a special card from the United States government permitting him to take orchids through customs. And so well was he regarded in his avocation that there is even, as the dean said, an orchid named after him, Phalaenopsis John Hope Franklin. We may never see his likes again. I leave the final words this afternoon to John Hope. In an address at the University of Missouri, he said, "Perhaps the very first thing we need to do as a nation and as individual members of a society is to confront our past and to see it for what it is. It is a past that is filled with some of the ugliest possible examples of racial brutality and degradation in human history. We need to recognize it for what it was and is, and not explain it away, excuse it, justify it. Having done that, we should then make a good faith effort to turn our history around so that we can see it in front of us, so that we can avoid doing what we have done for so long. If we do that, whites will discover that African Americans possess the same human qualities that other Americans possess. And African Americans will discover that white Americans are capable of the most sublime expressions of human conduct of which all human beings are capable. Then, we need to do everything plausible to emphasize the positive qualities all of us have, qualities which we have never utilized to the fullest, which we must utilize if we're going to solve the problem of the color line in the 21st century. Thank you.
Oh, I can't tell you how much being here with Bill makes me miss John Hope. But John Franklin is here, and Karen, and I see the tradition of constitutional history at Duke. Jefferson Powell, I don't think there's a better person who knows constitutional history in this country, particularly the history of the executive branch. Paul Hagan taught it, and now Joseph Blocher, Neil Siegel continue to make history a part of what they do, and that wonderful tradition goes on. I was asked to talk about how this course came into being, and it started with the renaissance of originalism as a method of constitutional interpretation. The reason is, early in the administration of Attorney General Meese, there became a considerable focus on originalism. What was the original understanding? And I realized that I needed to read the debates in the Constitutional Convention, which virtually no one, particularly people talking about originalism, seem to have done. And I tried to do it on my own and found out that the only way to really learn something is to offer a course in it and have to show up every day. So I did a 2-credit course in which we read the debates at the Constitutional Convention, starting with May 25th, 1787, Madison's daily diary, and discussed each and every day in the unfolding drafts and debates until the convention finally finished on September 17th, 1787, after that summer in Philadelphia, and submitted the Constitution for ratification. That was the entire course. We read Madison's account of the debates, and that's how I came to know them. Then it happened that our dean, Paul Carrington, had the most wonderful idea that our faculty should share an intellectual experience together. And he asked Professor William Leuchtenburg to teach a mini course to the law faculty on Roosevelt and the New Deal, the Depression, and court packing. And it was a wonderful experience for those of us on the faculty. I think 4 or 5 afternoons in the course of a semester, Bill came over and the faculty had that experience. And the dean then wondered how we could make it a course for our students. It wasn't enough to be a 1-credit course was of no use. So the dean asked, and I eagerly accepted the notion that we would hitch Bill's account of the constitutional revolution of 1937 et al. To my course in 1787, and we did that for a year. We had these 2 pieces of American constitutional history, the founding and the assertion of the authority of Congress to regulate the national economy and of the state and federal governments to ameliorate the harshness of the industrial workplace. We dealt with that constitutional revolution. Then one Sunday morning, I read in the paper that John Hope Franklin was giving a talk, this is in the early 1980s, on the campus at UNC on his latest book in progress, In Search of George Washington Williams. So I thought, gee, John Hope Franklin, I'd met him once. As Bill knows, this is a guy that really filled a room. When he walked in, everybody shut up, though he wanted to learn about other people and their experiences. So I wanted to hear John Hope talk about this amazing experience he had when he began researching From Slavery to Freedom. He was going through the library and looking at the collection of books on race, and there he found a 1,000-page, 2-volume history of the Negro in America, 1619 to 1880, of which he had never heard, by George Washington Williams. The book, a serious and thoughtful scholarly work, had been lost to history. And George Washington Williams developed. Nobody knew what happened to him. So for the next 30, 40 years, John Hope had as a secondary project tracking down George Washington Williams. Finding him, he found the clues that traced George Washington Williams to the Congo, where he protested the conditions in which King Leopold was imposing on that country, that he even traced and went to a small portside city where George Washington Williams died in England, and went to the unmarked grave and left a wreath there and a headstone in honor of this historian. Well, I was just riveted by this work and looked at what John Hope had done, his classic work on Reconstruction, and it occurred to me this is the missing piece. If you're going to do three elements of American constitutional history, it would be the 1787 founding with the debates in the Bill of Rights. It would be the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which was a reconceptualization and a reinvention of American constitutionalism, and then to have the New Deal piece. And that's when I asked John Hope to join us and to become a junior professor of law at Duke Law School, which he did. And I think those 7 years were the best experience I've ever had in an academic setting, though I learned one important lesson. Do not ever teach a course with two professors who regularly move students to tears. Do not do that. You don't want to be the third person on that match. Now, Bill has talked about the great outlines of John Hope's career. I remember what a great personal experience it was. We made this wonderful deal, the best deal I ever made in my life, that when either one of us received a large honorarium check or received an honorary degree, we would take the other to lunch. This was the best bet I ever made. I'm still 100 short in honorary degrees. But I remember your mother, John, thought we were quite amusing. I would always pick up your father in my red convertible, on a small red convertible, and he always wore this pork pie hat, so in the breezy qualities, and Aurelia always came out to wave us off to lunch, where I heard firsthand over those lunches John Hope tell what were the most painful stories in the most beguiling and even-handed way. It is really a quality that is hard to capture, that someone who never gave up an inch on his principles nonetheless was able to convey his experiences with such equanimity, with such equipoise, I believe was your word, and such even delight in telling those stories. When I say he never compromised on principle, there's one exception, which I'll come to at the end. John Hope's parents, a lawyer and a teacher, were readers and thinkers in a small, what was then would have been known as an all-colored town in Oklahoma, starting out in Rennesville. But John Hope, at the age of 3, his mother took him with her for nothing else to do with him when she taught her classes, her elementary classes, and he sat at the back and was absorbing everything. And by the age of 5, his squiggles had actually turned in, she discovered, to writing words and sentences as he was following along what was happening in the classroom. Every night, his father always read and wrote, or read or wrote. And that was the experience that he had growing up. Off to Fisk he goes, where there is an encounter with Professor Ted Currier. He had always assumed he would go back and help his father in his father's law practice. So his father's office had been burnt out in the anti-black Tulsa riots, and then he had struggled to make a living in that segregated economy. But John Hope had always planned to follow him until he had been inspired about history by Professor Theodore Currier at Fisk. And it was Professor Currier's vision that John Hope should go to Harvard and pursue his PhD. And John Hope did apply, but realized upon acceptance, while they were willing to have a person of color in their PhD program, they were not willing to offer or risk any fellowship money on such what seemed to be a novel experience. Professor Ted Currier, a white professor, in 1935 said, "Money is not going to stand in the way of your going to Harvard." Went down to the bank, took out a second mortgage on his house, and paid the money for John Hope to go to Harvard. After his work in his master's degree, Harvard saw the error of his ways and provided help, along with John Hope's multiple jobs, for him to finish his PhD. And in 1939, he came back to the South. He tells those stories about every different Southern library, and John Hope was a historian of the South, always saw himself as a Southern historian, working in the archives of the Southern libraries under always varying conditions of indignity. But as he taught, he wanted to write a history from slavery to freedom of African Americans in this continent. And he tried to work on that book at home, working on the small kitchen table, while carrying this enormously heavy teaching load of the kind that one had to teach at St. Augustine's at Shaw in those days, a shared office with other professors and no assistants, and trying to stack up the books he was working with on the small kitchen table, until Aurelia said, "You're not going to get that done unless you go to the Library of Congress, and we can live on my librarian salary." And off he went to the Library of Congress, where he worked, and this would be 1946, 1947, on From Slavery to Freedom. It's hard to overstate the significance of that work. The great historian David Levering Lewis says, there is before and after. That From Slavery to Freedom made African American history a part of the story of America in a way that it had never been before, and forever changed how history was written and understood. John Hope really appreciated a major essay on his work in the New York Review of Books, which said that there was no John Hope Franklin school of history, no John Hope Franklin approach. And the reason was that John Hope, being a pioneer of this academically based African American historian, was so taken with the notion that his work had to satisfy every conceivable measure of objectivity, that he was rigorous in not wanting to have a school and approach, it's a slant, etc., but to tell the story of race in America in a way that would be accepted. He carried that burden, and he thought to me that New York Review of Books essay got it exactly right. So from Fisk, John Hope, with the acclaim for From Slavery to Freedom, with his international lectures that he gives widely, he, at a very young age in his 30s, receives what he always thought would be the ultimate end of an academic career, and that is an appointment to Howard University, the preeminent historically black college in America in its time, though he said when he got there, he felt depressed, not because he wasn't honored to be at Howard, a place with extraordinary colleagues. We in law know Charles Hamilton Houston and the others on the law faculty there, but that he knew where he was going to end his career, that he would be in the same place, that there was nowhere to go, and that in his 30s, when he was in his 70s and 80s, he would still be teaching at Howard because that was all a person of color could ever do. And it did not occur to him that there would be any other or alternative futures for him. As his acclaim grew, it was really quite a major matter. He would be giving major speeches, and ever more larger numbers of the 52-person history department at Brooklyn College would be coming to attend and sit in the back and listen to various lectures he gave in New York and in other places at historical associations. And in the 1950s, after the Brooklyn College, CCNY, these were great institutions in the 1950s as the urban institutions where so many people in the waves of immigrants came and worked and learned the excitement and the vibrancy of those places, so that that dramatic appointment, that front page of the New York Times, Negro named to head department at Brooklyn College, a front page story in the New York Times. I've stood and looked at that framed front page of the New York Times and wondered in awe at that being such a dramatic story, coupled with the fact that it took over a year for John Hope and Aria to find a place to live. None of the 30 real estate brokers would deal with them in Brooklyn. None of the banks would offer a loan. It took more than a year for colleagues of his and an attorney for them to find a permanent place to live in Brooklyn, as he was chair of the history department. One of the great things he did was to buy art from the Harlem Renaissance with money he had left over, which he told me was the great amusement of his colleagues on the history faculty at Brooklyn College, that John Hope had this idea that he was investing in, quote, colored art. Well, it turns out some of that art, Romari Bearden, the great migration works, as you know, some of that turned out to be brilliant insights of work that would come to be greatly regarded, and I've always been amused that they did not understand that. So I heard all of those wonderful stories. I had wanted to play for you all. It turns out I have none of the recordings of John Hope's classes that I thought I had. I have one recording, but the quality of it, I suffered through it so I could tell you what he said. Was really John Hope's last class he taught in the law school. I think it may have been after we'd finished the course, but it was a special add-on class. On January 24th, 1993, I was not yet in the government, but still working out in the White House, and I called John Hope with the sad news that Thurgood Marshall had died. And shortly after, at the end of that week, we had a class here in the law school at which John Hope talked about his experiences with Thurgood Marshall, and it's really quite extraordinary. It was in 1947 that Thurgood Marshall called John Hope Franklin and asked for his assistance with a case that Thurgood Marshall had brought as part of his extraordinary and brilliant strategy for taking on segregation. It was the case of Lyman Johnson, a public school teacher in Louisville, who was a graduate of the Kentucky State College for Negroes and who was seeking admission to the University of Connecticut to do graduate work. And he was turned down. This is in the era of separate but equal, and the state's defense was that he could undergo further studies at the Kentucky State College for Negroes, and that would be the full equivalent to whatever he could obtain by graduate studies at the University of Kentucky. John Hope was to be a young professor, the expert witness that the resources available at the Kentucky State College were not those of the University of Kentucky. There were only 2 professors. The library was completely minimal. There were no fellowships, et cetera. So John Hope went down, interviewed everybody, reviewed everything in the 2 libraries at the University of Kentucky, at Lexington and the State College, and was prepared to be Thurgood Marshall's expert witness when they put on their case. But first, the state put on a case and had testimony that that the resources available at the 2 institutions were the same. And they break for lunch, and John Hope says that, he talked about the boldness of Thurgood Marshall, that Thurgood Marshall said, "That's it, I've had it. I've had it with this bullshit. I'm going to go in, we're going to move for directed verdict and ask for the immediate admission of Lyman Johnson to the University of Kentucky. And people say, wait, we had to put on our case, especially John Hope, who was going to be the expert witness as a young professor in this case. But what Marshall understood was, for the judge, it wasn't about segregation or racial equality. It was about insulting the intelligence of the judge. To stand there and tell this judge these two programs, one of which, were the same, right, was an insult. And Thurgood Marshall, the great reader of people, thought, I've got a chance. I've got a chance to go in and say, and the judge granted the directed verdict and ordered the university. And John Hope says, I don't get to testify, right? What was so wonderful about this lecture is that John Hope's honesty was great. He said that, he began by saying that it had saddened him to see the picture of Thurgood Marshall on the front page of the Washington Post the day after he died. An older man, a weak man, eyes not sharp or clear. And he said, I regret that you did not know, you young people, you never knew Thurgood Marshall in his great years. That his Supreme Court time was something of a victory lap for Thurgood Marshall. And that you should have known him when he was taking those actions that I think quite arguably made him the greatest lawyer of the 20th century. That unlike the sort of Thurgood Marshall of the later years on the court, where he did good work and his colleagues like Sandra O'Connor talk about what they learned from him, but his great vigorous period was before that. Ann Dellinger's having me read Devil in the Grove. Extraordinary story of the courage of Thurgood Marshall, literally risking his life, not in the most intense situations. And it was from in the South, taking the train alone by himself to go into places where there'd been lynchings and race riots, and to be the lawyer that came. And it was from John Hope that I first heard about what would happen when the word spread that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was sending Marshall south. Thurgood is coming. Would spread like electrifying, and crowds would gather of African Americans at the train station to greet in these small southern towns as Thurgood Marshall came. But it was in 1953, the Brown versus Board of Education was argued in the 52-53 term, but it wasn't decided because the court ordered re-argument and asked the parties both to address the historical question about what was the understanding of the 39th Congress about the effect of the 14th Amendment on racial segregation, and to address that historical question. John Hope was teaching for the summer at Cornell when he got a call from Thurgood Marshall. He said, what are you going to be doing in the fall? And John Hope said, well, I'm going to be back teaching my courses at Howard. And Marshall said, no, well, that's one of the things you're going to be doing. But the other thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be living at the Algonquin Hotel and helping us write this brief. And Brown versus Board of Education to write this history brief with our team of historians, great figures, C. Van Woodward and others. Worked on this, and that was part of it. It's interesting, John Hope's description of what a handsome, vigorous, and enormous presence Thurgood Marshall was in his glory days reminded me so much of John Hope. I think of all his accolades, his favorite maybe was when he was pictured in his bathing suit on the front of Modern Maturity magazine of the AARP. He was so vain. He really loved that picture. And he was. So that was those were the great experiences. I'll just close with this. I had been away in the afternoon that he passed away. And I was very sorry when I heard he passed away. I thought, I wish I had written something. I know John and Karen had been caring for him, but we knew that this was not going to last forever. And I thought, I just wish I had written something. When I came home at dinner time, there was a voicemail from the Washington Post editor from mid-afternoon asking, could I write something for the next morning? And I called back and said, I'm sorry, I just got your message, but I said, how long could if you really pushed it, how long could I have? And they said, well, it's 7 o'clock, but, half an hour. I said, I'll have you something in half an hour. So let me close. I'll tell you one last story. When Barack Obama first became a serious nominee, a serious possible candidate, people didn't know much about him, and there were academic intellectuals who questioned his, quote, authenticity as an African-American, given how he had grown up and all. And I called John Hope, and that was a little drumbeat of talk. And I called John Hope, and I said, what do you think about this? Professor X just said, he's shouldn't be considered an authentically black candidate. And John Hope said, wait till they see his family. He said, that will end that. And he said, it's going to be more important culturally for that family to be the first family than it is for him to be president. We will have a first lady who's an African-American. And he said, that reverses a narrative of 350 years. So its importance cannot be overstated. It was a great, great insight. But in any event, I'll read you just a bit of what I wrote. John Hope Franklin, who died yesterday at 94, was one of the most remarkable Americans of the 20th century. He was the master of the great American story of that century, the story of race. John Hope wrote it, he taught it, and he lived it. For 7 years, he and I taught constitutional history together at Duke, and I never ceased to marvel at how he managed both to embody this history and yet recount it with an extraordinarily candid honesty. Our students would fall into the deepest hush while he recounted his experiences, researching his epic 1947 work From Slavery to Freedom in segregated libraries at Southern universities and Southern state institutions. He would describe the various Jim Crow rules he was required to navigate: a separate table from white patrons, a prohibition on being waited on by white female librarians, without a trace of bitterness. After the acclaim for From Slavery to Freedom and his other writings brought him a place on the Howard University faculty while still in his 30s, he thought he had achieved his final academic appointment. History proved him wrong. And I recount the front page story in the New York Times. John Hope never compromised on principle. Well, almost never. He told and retold the story of a decision he made as a young teenager in Tulsa to go see a performance by a star of the Metropolitan Opera. His parents strongly disapproved of his decision since it entailed his sitting in the segregated balcony of the convention center in Tulsa. He later, and that was part of his lifelong interest in great music. He later wrote, quote, "I am not altogether proud of going to Convention Hall, and there are times even now while enjoying a symphony or an opera when I reproach myself for having yielded to the indignity of racial segregation." He worked on a crucial brief for Brown versus the Board of Education. He marched to Selma. He lectured all over the world and taught all of America to see through his uncompromising eye. But it was not just what he did, but how he did it that marked his greatness. He understood that the public good was not merely a set of substantive outcomes. It is also defined by how we go about reconciling our competing visions of that public good. It is about how we view one another when we peer across the great divides of policy, preference, political party, and personhood. John Hope Franklin looked at those who opposed him and saw fellow human beings. He was no Pollyanna. He knew, as my son Drew once wrote, that we are still always crossing that bridge from Selma to Montgomery. But John Hope always looked at the state trooper blocking the bridge, the figure standing in the way of freedom, and he saw there another child of God. He knew, as Charles Black once said, that the tragedy of Southern race relations was drawn from that prima materia of all tragedy, the failure to recognize kinship. Thank you.
Well, it must have been a wonderful course, and let us leave it there. Thank you very much.